I'm Kelly Davis. I'm a poet and editor, and I've lived in Maryport for about 35 years. And I was delighted when Dolly Money, who runs the gallery with her husband Brian, had this wonderful idea of celebrating Maryport's literary heritage in this new gallery. So I asked a group of poet friends to write about the famous literary figures who visited here, and they rose to the occasion amazingly and produced this lovely pamphlet. And we are very lucky because we have Greville Lindop introducing the evening. He's also written a lovely preface for the book. Greville is a former professor of literature at Manchester University, and he is the author of the Literary Guide to the Lake District. So he's the ideal person to open the event for us. So I'll hand you over to Greville now.
Huge welcome to you and this absolutely fabulous gallery. I mean, I'd heard that the Shipping Bow Gallery had one or two paintings by William Mitchell on its premises, but I hadn't realised that we were going to be surrounded by these absolutely beautiful and really atmospheric marine paintings. I mean, even the really terrifying painting of the half-shattered ship over there being tipped by the billows, and these quieter paintings, including one that looks very much like Maryport harbour on the wall there. Absolutely appropriate, because we're going to be hearing poems which are inspired by episodes of Maryport's past. Maryport has a fascinating literary history, although we can't trace it back before the 18th century, really, although we know that there must have been many, many local poets, local singers and local musicians. But it struck me that we're kind of a couple of weeks late in one sense, because this event really should have been happening on Valentine's Day, because I mean, what other seaport has a more poetic name than Maryport? I mean, Humphrey Senhouse calling the town after his beloved wife Mary. If that isn't poetic, I don't know what is, but it's second best because it's actually 29th of February, isn't it? So that special day that only occurs once every 4 years and is particularly dedicated to love from the lady's point of view. So that's good as well. The particular theme tonight, as you'll see if you've picked up the book that's available here, and a very beautifully produced little book it is. It's called Literary Ghosts in the Gallery, and you'll see that the event is inspired by the literary visitations of the past. There's a slightly spooky photograph of part of the gallery itself with the looming face of Charles Dickens appearing spectrally upon it. So that gives you something of the flavour. We're looking at the visits made, or perhaps not made, or mythically made to the area by famous writers of the past. They're not all mythical, because one of my favourite Maryport authors is a chap called Jonathan Douglas, who was not only a poet in the early 19th century, but he was also the governor of the Maryport workhouse. I've challenged the historical world to come up with another poet who was also in charge of a workhouse, and so far nobody's managed to do it. I mean, plenty of poets have ended up in the workhouse, but they haven't been in charge. But Jonathan Douglas was in charge of the Maryport workhouse in the 1830s. He was the governor. He wrote poems compassionately about the poor people that he saw. One of his subjects was the impoverished people waiting to emigrate to America on the quayside, and he writes, On the quay piled with luggage, I wander alone among groups of the strangers, unheeded, unknown. How fondly they linger, and weeping embark, as lonely as those who were saved in the ark, to people new regions, when doomed to explore a world of wide waters without any shore. It strikes me that if there's any folk musicians here, you've got a ballad there that could well be sung. You know, I can feel a tinge of Irish music coming on when I hear that. You know, doomed to explore the world of wild waters without any shore. I think we've got somebody needs to set this to music. Well, that's Jonathan Douglas back in the 1830s, though he did also complain that the workhouse was, because of the unceasing din of noisy inmates, it was unfit retreat to woo the muses in. So apparently writing poetry in the workhouse wasn't always a picnic. But the particular focus tonight is on the more famous writers who visited Maryport. We can be pretty confident that Wordsworth was here from time to time, because from 1820 onwards, he was the official distributor of stamps for the district, which means not that he was selling postage stamps, but it was like, you know, today's stamp duty when you buy a house. There were various kinds of legal documents that had to have a government so-called stamp affixed. And Wordsworth's job was to come round various districts collecting the tax that was paid for these official stamps. He must have come to Maryport. It was part of his patch, as it were. And if he came to Maryport, it's quite possible that he stayed at the Golden Lion. That would have been the natural place. We do know that in 1857, Charles Dickens came here. There he is on the cover of the pamphlet. His friend Wilkie Collins, with whom he was touring Cumbria, was lying at Allenby nursing a sprained ankle that he got trying to climb Carrick Fell. And Dickens passed the time by coming to Maryport and having a look around. He wasn't overly impressed by it. He seems to have seen it as a mixture of half a dozen other places. He says it's a bit of waterside Bristol with a slice of Wapping, a seasoning of Wolverhampton, and a garnish of Portsmouth. And he says altogether a great deal too rusty, too muddy, and too dirty altogether. He wanted to be idle, he said, and Maryport was busy and full of work. So maybe he thought it was a seaside resort, but it wasn't. It was a port and an industrial town. Some of the associations of Maryport are a bit more ghostly than that. There are rumours that Wilkie Collins used Ewanrig Hall as the model for Limmeridge Hall in The Woman in White. Local historians dispute this, but the legend itself has now become attached to Ewanrig Hall. So in a way, the hall is haunted by the ghost of Wilkie Collins' Woman in White, as just as Limmeridge Hall in the novel was. What we're quite definite about is that in the 1880s, two more famous and contrasting poets came. In 1882, amazingly, Gerard Manley Hopkins was here, not writing about wind hovers, but giving fiery Catholic sermons at some kind of religious mission, which I think was probably aimed at the Irish emigrants who would have landed at Maryport, and also at counteracting the influence of the dreaded Methodists who were starting to make inroads. So Hopkins said he enjoyed giving sermons with plain speaking because he enjoyed calling a spade, which I suspect meant that he was telling the congregation off about their terrible sins and the fact that they hadn't been to confession lately. But Hopkins's poetry, which was never published in his lifetime, lay several years ahead at that point. And then 3 years later, who of all people came but Oscar Wilde, who was here in 1885, and he was speaking on the value of art in modern life. Well, we couldn't be in a place that better exemplifies the value of art in modern life. We're surrounded not only by William Mitchell, but in the next room by the paintings of Percy Kelly and the wonderful enterprise of this gallery. And, you know, we're hugely grateful for the hospitality of Dolly and Brian, who've allowed this event to take place here. And I have to say that I think the yellow and blue colouring of the building is really nice. So I gather there's been a little bit of controversy about that, but I'm all for the colour, and I think the preoccupation with everything being white is very much a 20th century fad, which is now fading. So bring on the colour. I'm told that the colour in this room is gallery red, or words to that effect, art gallery red. So I think it's perfect for the paintings we've got here. Anyway, from paintings to poetry, we've got 10 Cumbrian poets here writing about the extraordinary interconnections between Maryport and past writers, and all I have left to do, really, apart from saying once again a huge welcome to you, huge thanks to Brian and Dolly, is to invite the 10 wonderful poets to come and give us their poetry and share their insight and imagination with us.
Hi, my name's Ilse Pedler. I'm one of the poets, and it was when Kelly asked me if I'd like to be involved in the project, I jumped at the chance. It sounded really interesting. I have to admit that I don't have any connections with Maryport, but it sounded like a really interesting project. And when I started writing the poems, our brief was to sort of choose one of these literary figures and write about them. And I was reading through all the different figures and they sounded so interesting. But then I started researching Maryport and the town itself and its history. And actually that caught my attention as much as the people that came to it and the different phases in the history of the town. And so the poem that I wrote is actually the first in the pamphlet, and it kind of acts as an introduction to Maryport, but also the people that came to it. So I'd like to read that one for you first. And it's the history in these streets. All places begin somewhere, and this, a settlement at Ellen's Foot, its people bound by wind and tide, has witnessed more history than most. Home of Spanish legions at the edge of empire, next fallen into ruin and unrecorded in the Doomsday Book. Then Cole bought trade, and Senhouse saw his chance, applied to Parliament to build a town. Laid out in grids of cobbled streets and handsome squares, named after his wife, Maryport was born. Young Maryport tried her hand at many trades, but building ships became the purpose of the place. Pete's and Ritson's yards bringing jobs for all. From skeletons of wood, great masted ships were clothed, launched broadside on. The waves they made so high, they soaked the eager crowds on opposite Moat Hill. Prosperity grew the town with steel and steam, and amid the din of hammering iron, the roar of furnaces, our characters emerge. First Wordsworth, collector of the stamp, with sombre face and furrowed brow, but mind alive, composing verses as he walked and dreamt of distant fells. And Southey too, the often overlooked, passed some pleasant days at Netherhall, its tower walls thicker than the height of any man. Next to the black and dusty streets came Dickens on a lazy tour, an idle apprentice devising elaborate tales of indolence and ease. Hopkins, on his Lenten mission, terrified the crowds who came to hear him preach, with fervent visions of damning flames and everlasting hell. And Oscar Wilde lectured to fawning crowds while plotting Lady Windermere's fan, no notion yet of the shame that would cause his fall. Today we walk the streets where all this history echoes, hear those voices snatched by gulls and carried out to sea, breaking back as waves relentless on the wall. And the second poem in the pamphlet, I did actually settle on one of the literary figures in the end, and it was Dickens in his Idle tour. And he and Wilkie Collins did a tour of the north, and Wilkie Collins, as Greville has just explained, Wilkie Collins sprained his ankle going up Carrick Fell and had to rest in Allenby, where it seemed that he ate lots of shrimps and watched the donkey trying to escape from the town. And then they wrote this small novel called The Lazy Tour of Two Idle Apprentices. So I wrote this poem about Dickens's visit to Maryport. Visit to a less than idle town. Here's a tale of two idle apprentices searching for their seaside idyll. Golden bars of sand with silver gulls, wisps of cloud brushed lightly on the canvas of the sky. Plenty of shrimps for an idle tea, and over idle conversation, what frivolous stories provide amusement for the two? On what pleasant promenades can imaginations take their turn? And then came one of them to Maryport. Its jagged streets filled with soot and steam, the din of hammering iron, the stench of boiling pitch and tar. The shore all littered with rusting scrap and heaps of coal, and above the roar of furnaces, cacophony of carts on tracks, comes a scream of rivets forced through metal sheets. And gulls, the skinny feral sort, feathers grey with smuts, swing in on wind with shrieks that pierce the choking smog, dive viciously to fight for every crumb of food. So here was found the dirty engine house of England, powered by grim-faced men in sweat-rimed clothes and careworn women who work through every waking hour. Best our fellows go their idle way and take their idle fancies too, while ships are built and stone is blasted from the ground, where wealth comes from, where true work is done. Thank you.
So my name is Luke. I moved to Workington this summer that's just been, and on the day that I saw the house where we're living now for the first time, I came to Maryport Roman Museum and thought this place was beautiful. I've got a couple of poems for you tonight, and the first of which is concerned with Wordsworth's visit. It was tricky to write because we know vastly little about what he did whilst he was here. We know he was here in 1829, and that he probably stayed in the Golden Lion, and that he was distributor of stamps at the time, and that's basically all. And so this poem emerged from it. It's called Lines Composed a Few Centuries from the Golden Lion. It goes like this. For a page of glass, he spies ink-blue lintels spring from smog and hulks thrown out on gouging seas. Where once leaned fishing shacks, and only foot or hoof-worn paths, named after rivers, not man's desire. And prior, a lone camp on Alauna's heights, whose guardians trusted gods to last, like letters scratched in stone. He whirls, this distributor of stamps in portly black, who was a wild man born from rock and rain, who was a slip of boyhood, skating glyphs in ice, and wonders who he'll be again. The other literary figure that I was interested in was Charles Dickens, who, as we've heard, came and had a very idle visit to the town where he wandered around and generally got underfoot. We'd heard his version of events under the moniker of Mr. Goodchild in his and Wilkie Collins' account. And I thought it would be interesting to try to imagine what the people of the town and the town itself might have written about him, both in the past and now in the present. And so this poem came out of it. It's called Maryport Receives Mr. Goodchild. And it goes like this. You do us a disservice, sir. We are not a garnish of Portsmouth. Rich in the orbit of Carlisle and Barbados, we know you. Come down from Allenby under smog-fold skies, murk white like fern kicked up from another ship tipping out of Ritson's yard. You chatter and poke. Will you idle with me? Will you idle? Let us teach you industry, as every chimney teaches the sky to grey and fires teach pots to cook. Can't you smell the tar a-bubbling, each waft settling on our yards like soot beaten from a carpet? There is smoke to make, iron to hammer, and rust to run the culverts into morass, and redden the fastness of moor and mud like sandstone loosed from earth for worship. Will you be idle? Will you be idle? Our jagged up and down hill lanes and thrown-up houses are startled by the blur of unnamed men, and our dusty black quarters receive the sweep from shawled women by fading candlelight. It is all a rush, sir. The streets tremble like papery reams, sorted in the half-lit cell of inundation by a postmaster who dreams and addresses of a world he will not see. How far these fragile correspondences fly, like crinkled moths in his giant hands, reaching through the distances of time and diminished in the stretch to now, when summers blast like furnaces, and winter streets are emptied by eerie wind, and windows are battened against the braying salt, and brittle plastic snags and seagrass docks overcome by great crashing arms of the sea. And here are your words again, in the snarl of all Maryport, of all the world, asking, will you be idle? Will you be idle now? Thank you.
I'm Ros, and I organise the Poets Out Loud group in Cockermouth. Before I read this indescribable 37-line piece that I call a poem, I'm going to tell you a bit about me. I was born in Workington, and I lived there for 6 years before my family moved to Cockermouth, where I spent my childhood and early teens. Then I decided that there must be more to life somewhere out there. So I left to see the world and make my fortune, or not. Anyway, after approximately 40 years, I came back with my husband, and we lived just outside Cockermouth for the last 10 years. I always maintained links with this area, making frequent visits to family living in both Cockermouth and Maryport. Over time, I've witnessed a great deal of changes in both places. The latest change in Maryport being the addition of this art gallery, which is something my younger self would never have envisaged. My previous experience and former concept of Maryport was a very different kind of place, although it's hard to tell whether that's because Maryport really has changed or that I, in my older, more middle-class eyes, observe it differently. All of which brings me to the topic of my poem, which is a reflection on the way Robert Southey's letter exposes his well-documented move away from the radical positions of his youth towards the conservatism of his later life. By 1821, he had moved away from promoting the needs and seeking help for the underprivileged individuals in society to enabling wealth to flourish within society, the trickle-down policy as the moral good. The shift in the application of his Christian morality and his sense of fairness is marked in the letter by his praise of the Senhouse's grandfather as the builder of homes for his workers. And with this letter, he seems intent on promoting Senhouse rather than talking about his trip, which is the pretext for it being sent. He makes a show by giving a little bit on the geography of the place, but his friendship with Senhouse is his only link to Maryport, and in the letter, Maryport is conspicuous mainly through its near absence. It is mentioned only in the context of creating a fitting image for the Senhouse family, and the fitting image is the one that is defined by Southey as being so. So this is my poem called Robert Southey's Letter. But I apologise if you haven't read the letter, because I should probably have brought that with me so you could have made a bit more sense of it. In his letter, John May, in 1821, Robert Southey talks about his visit to Nether Hall, but in it he makes mention of Maryport only fleetingly, taking more interest in recounting the long history of the home of his friend Senhouse and his family. The very stones of Nether Hall came from antiquity. So when his grandfather built a new town locally, it's not surprising that an antiquarian such as he chose a grid system and built neoclassically. He called it Maryport after his wife, a great beauty, whose portrait hangs in their dining room for all to see. Southey describes what he calls an interesting story about the ancestors who fought at and survived Naseby, before mentioning a bishop from the Senhouse family who preached at Charles I's coronation, reputedly. The letter mentions lineage, chivalry, church and royalty. I postulate that in its writing, Southey tried deliberately to implant ideas promoting a particular imagery, the quintessential foundation of British respectability. It follows that his friend Senhouse is most definitely formed of the right stuff and is gentlemanly, and therefore bound by the same warped morality of superior Britishness as defined by Southey, who thinks a gentleman always behaves properly, follows God's laws, prioritises justice and acts fairly, defends the weak and rejects tyranny, which denies the existence of British brutality as the building of empire grew progressively. Modernisers became important nationally. Thus was Maryport created benevolently to house new workers who were necessary, those nameless many who had no identity, as if the people of Maryport were a non-entity. They were simply overlooked by Southey, which may be seen as something of an irony, considering this man with his earlier poetry had tried to make the wealthy notice poverty. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Susan Cartwright-Smith. I've also chosen to write about Southey, who I have always pronounced Southey. Byron said it should be pronounced Southey, like mouthy, but I've only heard it as Southey. As Ross just said very eloquently, he, in his youth, wrote a lot about abolitionism and supported abolitionism and wrote protest sonnets about it. Now, I do like a protest sonnet. I've written some myself in the past. But as the letter to his financial advisor was praising Senhouse, the grandson of the founder of Maryport, it does raise questions, and especially to a modern audience, to why exactly he was invested in somebody who had made his wealth through trades of various types, and all of which would mean oppressing somebody somewhere. So it's kind of strange that he chose to go in that direction in his later years. And my sonnet it's an interactive sonnet, so you can make a choice as to which line you put in as to how cynical you feel about Southey's choices. So when you put your own line in that you choose, it scans as a sonnet, but I'll read all three out tonight, so it won't scan as a sonnet, but it is a sonnet. So, an interactive sonnet in the style of Southey's abolitionist protest sonnets. Southey, on a trip out west, did visit Senhouse, colleague, an acquaintance, friend, and while what he went there for is not explicit, a letter to his finance man did send. What purpose of this text? What to solicit from someone whose job maybe is to lend a shrewd investment? Surely not implicit in Senhouse trades. His money, will he spend and invest wisely, now that middle classes, gripped with abolition fever, now abated, have taken off their revolution-tinted glasses, yet still require their purse strings and their sugar bowls be sated? Still with belief their protests have created? Legacies have sprung from that he hated. The wealth on which his pals' pile raised and stood leaves hands red with Roman sandstone-coloured blood. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Valerie Moody, and I've lived in Maryport for over 45 years. As you've already heard, in the lazy tour of two idle apprentices, Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins came to Cumberland and described how they decided to stay at Allenby after hearing about the incredible sunsets over the Solway Firth. The previous day, Collins had badly sprained his ankle climbing Carrick Fell. So, on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 9th of September 1857, Dickens set out alone to walk the 6 miles to Maryport to collect his post. On his return, he was rather dismissive of Maryport, describing it to Collins as a bit of waterside Bristol with a slice of Wapping, a seasoning of Wolverhampton and a garnish of Portsmouth. Anyway, I'd now like to read you this recently discovered poem by Charles Dickens, which shows that he was actually very struck by the contrasting aspects of Maryport, and that his visit greatly inspired much of his future work. However, some people have claimed this poem was not actually written by Dickens at all, as it's not his usual literary style and appears to contain a degree of poetic licence. So I will leave you to judge for yourselves. So here we have A Visit to Maryport by Charles Dickens, or possibly not. I walked from Allenby to Maryport, along its wild and rugged shore. My first visit to this Cumbrian town, I knew not what it held in store. And so I arrived in Maryport with no great expectations, but found the people and the place a source of many inspirations. It was a tale of two cities I found. Waterside Bristol, my first thought, with a seasoning of Wolverhampton as I wandered round the port. Throw in a garnish of Portsmouth and then add a slice of Wapping. Here is shipbuilding, ironworks and coal, fishing boats and streets for shopping. A fisherman stood by his boat, sold 2 boys a pen'orth of shrimps. They said, "Please can we have some more?" So he chased the cheeky young imps. I sat down with my bottle of ale and he asked me to give him a sup. He said that he'd been through hard times, but something was bound to turn up. Then I wandered up Shipping Brow, pausing momentarily at the top to look in the fascinating window of an old curiosity shop. And next to that a confectioner by the name of Barnaby Rudge, who sold lollipops, sherbets and comfits, sugar mice, chocolate and fudge. I moved on up to High Street in order to collect my post. I passed a woman all dressed in white. She reminded me of a ghost. The assistant in the post office was curiously named Mr. Bumble, and amused me by continually saying that he was ever so humble. Now down the dusty street I go, till I pass the pastry cook's shop. At the edge of savage moor and morass is where I decide I will stop. And I see outlined in the distance a bleak house, grand and tall, stood beyond the confines of civilization, and I guess this is Unry Hall. So it's back up to the Golden Lion to meet with our mutual friend, newspaper publisher Robert Adair, and there my visit today must end. And as I left Maryport Harbour, the sun was beginning to set, and the fiery orange and golden sky is a sight I will never forget. Bars of burnished silver and gold formed streaks along the shore. I vowed Collins and I would soon return to see the sunset here once more. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jane Moss-Loughran. I live in West Cumbria, have done for some time. My main connection with Maryport is Kelly, but I do come here sometimes to photograph because the light loves Maryport. I chose Gerard Manley Hopkins because I had some connection insofar as when I was studying at A-level, I was introduced to him because I was studying Ted Hughes, who he looked a little bit like actually, and Dylan Thomas, and he was very influential with his very unconventional writing and his use of multiple adjectives and his use of imagery and his deep, passionate love of nature, which he felt conflicted with his faith, which is very sad. He was a very conflicted man. That and later on as a postgraduate, I studied at Manresa House. It was owned by London University at the time. and that was where he lived and worked. It was in Roehampton, and that was very interesting for me, already a fan, to be in the same place that he wrote and lived. His sojourn here was not so great. He wasn't much liked by the people of Maryport. A young priest who exhorted them to engage all their five senses in order to experience death and hell, when they themselves had a life of, many of them had a life of great privation about which he knew very little, because he had a very sheltered existence. So he wasn't, his sermons didn't go down very well here, but he was a consummate poet, and I think there's a divide between the sermons and the poetry. And it would be nice to do a bit of justice to the poet while also doing justice to the people of Maryport, who didn't like him very much. So there was this divide. He died quite young, unpublished in his time, and he was a very tortured individual, and I think that's what Maryport people got, was the tortured individual. The poem is called The Sakes, and that's because he called his preaching the sakes. It was for the sake of God, for the sake of his faith, for the sake of the people that he was preaching to. And occasionally, while I was researching it, I had to think, for goodness sake, because he got it so very badly wrong about the people of Maryport. So, sakes, and I will read it from here rather than my phone, as it's easier. Gerard Manley Hopkins, peripatetic poet priest, was sent to sing and preach at a retreat in Maryport in 1882. Anxious, unworthy, riven, and an exile from himself, conflicted communist, revolutionary sympathiser, and sensuous lover of nature, dark with self-loathing. His God could shun a lover of his own creation, as the poet watched the natural world evolve. He came to Maryport, breathing hellfire at the people, who smirked and mocked and loathed him. He beseeched these working men and their families to feel their earthly bodies wither like cocoons around their eternal souls. He bade them to imagine mortality and hell, to engage with all their senses. And though in truth he believed there was redemption in their labours, he chastised them and exhorted them like children. And yet they understood and faced down his visions every day. The many Irish on the half-built Senhouse dock, and locals brewing and fermenting, grinding and tanning, mills and ports and pits, the collieries of Ellenborough, Uanrig, iron blast foundries, shipbuilding, sail-making, forges, soil and toil. The glassy blue-black of the pit shafts, then salt air in their nostrils and their lungs, the scent of the earth beneath the plough, the taste of smoke and ocean, the friction of ropes on calloused hands, the heat of the furnace and the horse's shoe. Seeing their fellows old before their time, worn and done at 45, pulled lifeless, limbless from ships and mines, blood and iron, listening to the rigging creak, the plaintive sheep, the calls and cries. They'd seen, smelt, felt, tasted, heard it all before. They knew hell on earth and grief and death, and they knew heaven more or less, as the sunset from the harbour watch, that healing fire alight the sea and rocks, the feeling through their feet of sand and heat, and wandering through the wilderness of the brows and the weed-strewn shore, need they no more? Step down, priest, you're a fool. You could have set them free with your dashed triple adjectives, your prosody and guile. You could have read them poems that did not burn in your pious hell of self-denial. The Windhover, God's grandeur, pied beauty, or the kingfisher catches fire. Entrance them with the Deutschland's wreck, the drownings in the gale. It was not their five senses that you needed to ensnare, but your poor sixth sense, which failed. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Craig Davidson. Originally a Carlisle lad, I've spent most of the last 20 years living out west, the last 8 of them here in Maryport. I really like living here, not only due to the opportunities it presents me as a keen photographer with its lovely harbour and its beautiful sunsets, but for the warmth of its people. I chose to write about a preacher and poet who achieved poetic fame posthumously, Gerard Manley Hopkins. This piece is based on short extracts from an account, Hopkins in Maryport, and from a letter Hopkins sent to his friend Bridges on 3rd of April 1882. He had been to Maryport to take part in a mission, accompanied by another Jesuit priest, Father Alfred White. I've just added a teaspoon of local spice and a pinch of salt. I've written this in something akin to the local dialect. I hope it resembles how some broad speakers, particularly those of a certain age, might speak it today. And it may well include some words or their pronunciations that were in usage in the late 1800s. But it's a bit of a minefield. As I only got 8 minutes, as not an expert, I only ken a little bit, and who's not about to get a lecture from me, Maris. But what I will just say, however, is that it's common in local dialect for Y's to be inserted before vowels in common words, and similarly for letters to be simply omitted, particularly at the ends of words, or replaced with apostrophes. All that said, many people who lived here in the 1880s would somewhat ironically be speaking with a totally different accent and using another dialect entirely, but that's by the by. I narrate this as if I'm perhaps the ghost of a parishioner who witnessed the event, or maybe he's a mad monk. So here we go, High Mass. Gerard Manley Hopkins Lenten Mission, Maryport, Sunday, March the 12th, 1882. Or as I'd like to call it, when Father Hopkins put the fear of God into Maryport folk yan Sunday. He'd come to take part in a 2-week mission. A 2-week mission? Which was said to be somewhat like a revival, whatever that's supposed to mean. A revival, but without the hysteria and the heresy. Now, I don't know the who's and whys, but he, or maybe it's t'other Jesuit father accompanying him, I forget his name, had this huge following. The taverns around Senno Street, and there was a few, mind you, had never seen the likes of it afore, as folks had all left be bang on closing time, some even earlier than each afore, to get a decent neat kip. Then the march next morning towards church. Our 750 souls, many in need of saving, need out. Getting there early for a decent seat, or maybe just to get a seat for the 10 o'clock start. Our Ladies and St. Patrick's was even at the seams, long afore the bells stopped chiming, and the air was full of stench of last night's ale and stout. Loads of stout and fish for Friday's catch, and all the accompanying farts and giggles. And incense being hastily and vigorously wafted to try to sweeten the breaths of the hushed voices, and yanatwa other odours emanating from row upon row of plows overloaded with tightly huddled bodies. And I'll say this for us, we gave good order, Jane. We gave good order. And I wondered why a somewhat weaselly and pasty-looking fella could command sick respect and have Manley for his middle name. What's that about? Yeah. Regardless, he was held in high esteem, and would allow entourage for that there London he'd come, or some other sick nearby parish down south or whatever. I'd even ken Maris. Never mind, he sung High Mass gaily wheel, and there was plenty that joined in, some that gave up and some that never bothered. Any road, when he opened his mouth to preach his sermon, thou could hear a pin drop, apart from them that was snoring, and far less snoring than any yan would have ever imagined for so many hung hour or still care-eyed for the right of hour. A church full of hundreds of Irish workers, how are you, constructing the new Senhouse docks, and fishermen aplenty, and all their women folk and families, of course. And last but not least, the mere respectable folk with their snooty nebs, and well-dressed kids with claws with knee rips or stains, and shoes that were shiny and well-fitted, burdens with the Sunday bonnets on. Anyways, Hopkins really come out of his shell and delivered the sort of speech he'd never delivered afore, or so they say. He spoke plainly and strongly, sternly though might say, and called a spade a spade. I swear there was big fellas here quivering with fear, and little kids clinging firmly onto their mothers, eyes tightly shut, or cheeks wet with tears. He spoke about the last things, Dean, judgment and hell, and what a terrifying hell he painted, asking folk to imagine their own vision of it as he took them through it, using each of the 5 senses. I dare say smell was Jan that gave many folk the shivers, or even had them invoking. And there would be a few ran yam, and others gasping or bawling at taste, I'd imagine. He spoke of repentance and turning towards their redeemers. Some of today were trying to unlock the souls from the corpses, maybe. And hard work, being prayers that could merit them heaven, only brought them scant relief. By that time, faces were drained of colour. Women, porcelain white, transfixed. Men, hard as nails, heat stone, eyes averted. Bairns with hands, and not necessarily their own hands, over their mouths. Folk flay to their own shadows. And none who dare drift off to sleep again, for fear of never waking up. Thank you.
Hello. How could a southerner follow that? I will admit it, I come from Dickens country, but I've lived in Cumbria for almost 30 years. My chosen ghostly writer is Oscar Wilde, who is still popular to this day. And I'm delighted to have the chance both to learn a bit more about Maryport and also Oscar Wilde. His visit to Maryport must have actually roused a deal of comment and perhaps wry amusement from the local people. He'd recently returned from America, where he gave lectures on art, speaking on his passions of beauty and rational design in all aspects of life, which in Maryport, as we've heard, would have been something that would have been very hard to reconcile with the daily experience of the ordinary folk. Back home, when he was short of money, he decided to undertake a hectic tour of speaking throughout the UK and Ireland, and he gave over 230 lectures, travelling by train, which is very hard for us to imagine these days. He arrived in Maryport by way of Carlisle, Workington and Cockermouth, and thence to Ulverston. I did write several poems. I'm afraid I got a bit carried away, so I've had to shorten them to make them into a little story. I have it that Oscar Wilde arrived here in February 1884, which is slightly different from Greville's records, but then each source has its own information. But I'll stick to 1884. A smart young man off the train from Cockermouth steps out into the town of Maryport, and if the weather be cold, as is likely in February, perhaps he sports his green coat, lined with fur and trimmed thus at collar and cuffs, and beneath grey trousers, a black velvet waistcoat, a white shirt with cuffs folded, Van Dyck style, outside the sleeves of a black velvet jacket. Note the silk pocket handkerchief of a vivid strawberry red, the matching tie presented in a bow. Oscar was very keen on his clothes, and commentators of the time often remarked at least as much about his appearance as the content of his lectures. He wished for joy in all things, including clothes. So I have a little poem here called Dress for Joy. A man's apparel should not be limited to the gloomy frock coat, Consider one's memorial, to be attired forever thus in marble or bronze, the horror of it. There would be more joy in life if we made use of beautiful colour in our dress. And by far the most beautiful piece of drapery invented is the cloak. He reflected upon the rational dress of the miners in the western United States who wore wide hats to protect them from the sun, which is practical, high boots, again, sensible, and the dashing cloaks, which he greatly admired. I'm not quite sure where the dashing cloaks fitted in when it came to mining, but obviously Oscar Wilde admired them very much. I imagine him shopping in Maryport in 1884. What would he have found? Maybe a cloak. Here in Senhouse Street, we have many excellent shops. There are clothiers and linen drapers, emporiums for fancy goods, confectioners, tobacconists and dealers in tea, milliners and leather goods, boots and shoes and sewing machines, a bookshop, stonemasons for headstones, watchmakers for repairs. You'll find a plumber, a solicitor, upholsterers for your chairs. But for such a fine young dandy, a tailor's shop could be the thing. Try Crone & Co. at number 72. Or in Crosby Street, there's Redmayne's Durafit, direct from their factory in Wigton. Now, I understand that at least two of those shops or businesses are still going to this day, so it must be worth investing in a Durafit suit. I think that his ideas on dressing would have amused quite a man who had to spend his working life in a shipyard or down a mine. The Van Dyke cuffs would very quickly get dirty. But his idealised visions included also home decoration and other aspects of life. But at this point, I introduce what I call the cynical commentator. There is nothing lacking in Maryport for those with money to spend. There are charitable associations for the poor souls who do not. We have schools for the youth of our fine growing town, societies for literature and science. The Mechanics' Institute in Catherine Street lies within the Athenaeum. It has a library and reading room, and up top a public hall for improving lectures such as this one. Just buy yourself a ticket and sit down. Now, those of you who are Maryport born will probably remember the Athenaeum, which was in Catherine Street, but it was demolished in 1983. So, but apparently it served a useful purpose. But going back to Oscar Wilde, not only did he have a distinctive appearance, but he also had a memorable voice. He lost his Irish accent at Oxford, but perhaps retained some of the rhythms of speech. Observers at the time record him speaking rapidly in precisely enunciated syllables, mezzo in pitch, rhythmic and varied in tone. If you read Wilde's lectures, his voice comes through strongly in his texts, and I think of him striding about the stage, declaring his lines rather theatrically. But I can imagine his lecture in Maryport, and the source which I have records it as being about house decoration, his house beautiful, which is the subject of my next poem. The House Beautiful. I am here to talk to you all about the value of beauty in modern life, in particular in our homes. Our House Beautiful is not a museum for gentler times, but a place of happiness and joy, a place where we embrace the craftsman's skill and rational design. There is beauty in good craftsmanship. Respect the artisan, his work will endure. Be cosmopolitan in your choice. Maybe you know already about colour and light, how they affirm happiness in our daily lives. Put stained glass in your windows, red tiles on the hall floor. Be guided by your wife. Listen to her. A woman has a natural ability in matters of taste. Abhor the jangling cacophony of mismatched and inappropriate colour. A craftsman's hand, his artisan's skill, itself a thing of beauty. Noble design derives not from idle fancy nor purposeless daydreams. There is much bleakness in machine-made things. His reference to cosmopolitan is another ideal where he asks us to take what is best from the craftsmen of the world, irrespective of origin. But I think Maryport probably had its own idea of being cosmopolitan, because the ships would sail from Maryport with people and coal and steel and all those practical things, and they would come back with other practical things like wool and tea and cotton. So I doubt that they had many wonderful artefacts coming back as main cargoes of the ships. But I finish with a short footnote. We are no slouchers here. There is work in shipyards, ironworks, mills and quarries, dockyards and mines. The ubiquitous modern railway now connects us to Carlisle. Maryport ships sail around the world with British coal and steel. So thank you.
Well, I think I've learned more about Maryport tonight through these poems than any other time, because I've not been to Maryport very much, but I was, and as you can see, so rich in art and literary writings and visitors. And I was drawn to Oscar Wilde because he's such a brilliant writer and had such a tragic ending. So this poem really, I wanted to imagine I was in the audience this particular night. A talk by Oscar Wilde on the value of art in modern life. Maryport, 28th of February, 1884. Picture that bitterly cold night in 1884, inside the crowded assembly rooms. Outside, the sun long set over the estuary, streets quiet as birds in their nests, and wind all done with whipping up the sea air. Many of us away from our safe firesides to hear Mr. Wilde, who also, having walked directly from his lodgings at the Golden Lion Hotel through the same streets, had arrived to face a northern audience, a far cry from the glitzy London Savoy. And there we were, industrial workers and wives, seated in rows, curious, bristling with excitement, waiting to hear this writer, novelist and poet, an effeminate who found a way to marry the role of rebel, bohemian and dandy with aristocratic culture, who believed there is only one thing worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. 2 rows in front of us, I heard Mabel whisper, "Did he come by carriage or on train across the Solway? Fancy coming all that way to Lal Maryport, and all that art in him." We'd never seen the likes. Mr. Wilde striding the floor, dressed in his fur-edged, full-length coat, sad, brilliant eyes, summer-long hair, gentle complexion, and generous lips, set to spill words liberated from Victorian preconceptions. And so he began. And we listened to his witty aphorisms, his penchant for flowers, and how London at the time was the living embodiment of the aesthetic movement led by Rossetti, Whistler, Burne-Jones, and how Wilde's ideas on art, beauty, and personal freedom challenged Victorian Puritans. How the satirist Phil May, Chelsea Art Club member, sent his illustrations of cutting wit to London periodicals, including his caption of Wilde and the American painter A. Whistler, which read, "Wilde, that was an awfully good joke you made last night. I wish I could say it was mine. Whistler, you will, my boy, you will." We laughed, blushed, and cried, and by the end of that night, the sound of applause rose like iron waves against the docks. We talked about it for years. Thank you.
And we've almost reached the end of our poetry evening. I'm going to read my poems now from this booklet. And the first one takes us back to Wordsworth. And I've begun with a quotation from one of his poems, Wordsworth in Maryport. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom it to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. From Wordsworth's The World is Too Much With Us. When he came to Maryport, it was the latter part of his life. He wasn't really writing poetry anymore. As we heard, he was the distributor of stamps. Not exactly romantic, the need to earn a crust, balance the books, keep body and soul together, but even poets have to do it. So William Wordsworth was no doubt pleased to be appointed distributor of stamps in Westmoreland, gaining a regular £400 per annum, enough to support his family, his housebound sister Dorothy, and his servants in a house as grand as Rydal Mount. On a visit to Maryport, staying at the Golden Lion, he may have walked round the harbour when the wind and rain let up. Perhaps he watched the waves crashing, considered nature's unstoppable force, our human desire for certainty, the constraints of responsibility. And my next poem is about Ewanrig Hall and the Wilkie Collins connection. As we've heard, Wilkie Collins actually spent most of his time at the Ship Inn in Allenby when he was here because of his sprained ankle. But Dickens was walking back and forth to Maryport to collect letters, and I'm sure he talked to Wilkie Collins about what he'd seen. But it's still a strange mixture of fact and fiction, this link between Ewanrig Hall and Limmeridge House in Collins' novel, The Woman in White. I thought a lot about this and, how these associations grow up. And I actually went to Ewanrig Hall, and there's very little left of it, sadly. But I thought about the woman in Collins' novel, Anne Catterick, who was locked away in an asylum. And there is also a rumour that there is a ghostly woman who haunts Ewanrig Hall. Women could be labelled mad so easily for reading novels, being too religious, hysterical, lazy, or greedy. Getting pregnant, wanting a divorce, grieving a loved one's loss. They had no voice, they took the blame. On a wet, windy December day, there is little left to see at Ewanrig Hall. Some sandstone walls, arched windows, broken fencing, signs saying, "Danger, keep out." Nature ignores the warnings. Moss and lichen creep over stone. Brambles colonise the earth. A ghostly presence lingers. In front, there's a circular lawn where ladies in crinolines may have sipped tea. So many layers of history. A medieval peel tower. A deserted and decaying mansion. Once a grand residence, a farmhouse, a burnt-out ruin. Did Wilkie Collins set his novel here? The evidence is scarcely there. but a woman in white is said to haunt this place. The year Collins's book was published, Henry Christian, last Ewan-Rig heir, died, and his grieving widow was locked away. Since then, much has changed, and much has stayed the same. And to finish on a happier note, as I said earlier, I've lived in Maryport for 35 years, and about 30 years ago, we moved to a beautiful house at the top of Camp Road, which is very much part of Maryport's history, and I feel very lucky to live there. We never tire of the views. And I like to think that Oscar Wilde may once have visited. I think, he would have been friendly perhaps with the Hine brothers who owned the house where we live. And of course, people come and go, but buildings remain. And in a way, we are all just caretakers. And tonight we've heard about the extraordinary people who have walked these streets, as Ilse said in her opening poem, and it's wonderful to feel some connection with the past. The big room, this is the room that made us buy the house, with its moss green velvet curtains opening on a perfect view across the Solway Firth. Scottish mountains rising out of swirling inky mist, subtle as a Japanese silk painting. On crisp blue sky days, the windows frame an Ordnance Survey map of fields. On summer evenings, blood orange sunsets paint rhomboids on the walls. When we arrived, I was pregnant with my second son and later sat in the worn leather club chair to feed him. Every Christmas we opened presents by the glowing fire, piled on logs till flames leapt up the chimney. During power cuts, we huddled round the embers, played Scrabble by candlelight. Once a bird flapped down and burst out, sooty and terrified. In the 1880s, Alfred Hine, joint owner of the home shipping line, lived here with family and servants. When Oscar Wilde visited Maryport to lecture on the value of art, perhaps he leant a velvet-clad elbow on this marble mantelpiece, gazed up at the piped cream mouldings on the ceiling. Guests' mouths have gaped at the sight of this room. With furniture pushed back, it's big enough for dancing. The walls have shaken to Irish jigs played on fiddle, banjo and flute. But now it's mostly just the two of us, reading quietly in armchairs on either side of the hearth. When we leave, new caretakers will move in with packing cases and toddlers. May this door open wide for them as it did for us. Thank you.
Well, I think you'll all agree that after so much poetry, we don't need to return for too long to prose. But I can't help celebrating the multifaceted dialogue that's been going on this evening. Visually, we've got this fabulous dialogue between William Mitchell and Percy Kelly. If you haven't had a chance to look properly at the paintings, do come back and spend some time. There's a whole room of Percy Kelly in there, which not everybody may have seen. And the two artists speak to each other so beautifully. Do consider, if you haven't already done so, buying the book. Again, there's a dialogue here. Craig Davidson's beautifully incisive, beautifully composed photographs complement the poems so well. You've got a dialogue of word and image there, which is well worth contemplating. And speaking of Craig Davidson, what I think Hopkins would have agreed that we've lost a great preacher there. I would love to hear Mr. Davidson's Sunday morning sermon, if it's anything like his account of Hopkins. So we've been lucky. It's only Thursday evening at the moment, isn't it? But it'll stand us in good stead for Sunday morning. And then we've had this wonderful interplay between writers of the past and poets of the present, showing how everything from the titles of Dickens novels through to legends of possible literary connections by way of the visits of famous poets and novelists to Maryport can spark completely new creations in the present day. I was amazed reading the drafts of this pamphlet by the inventiveness of the poets. I mean, we have the Ros Edwards in Robert Southey's letter. I don't know whether you picked this up listening by ear, but she has 37 lines, all rhyming on the same sound. It's an incredible technical feat. Susan Cartwright Smith managed to create a sonnet in which you've got 3 optional lines. You need to see it on paper and try it with the 3 different options to see how well it works. But there's an incredible degree of inventiveness here going on, and all of that is bouncing off the histories and legends of the past. So Maryport is alive and kicking, and I think the future of creativity here is richer than ever. So buy the pamphlet, come back to the gallery again, and I hope we can all meet up again soon. Thank you so much, and huge thanks to the poets. Let's show our appreciation of the gallery, the poets, the photographs, the whole evening. It's been wonderful. And don't forget that the Maryport Arts and Literature Festival starts tomorrow up at the Sen House Museum. So do come up there. There's a whole wealth of wonderful talks, readings and events going on there too. But now here's to the poets and to the art. Thank you, poets. Why don't you all come through, come and show yourselves. Come on. Let's see everybody.